The Stalingrad obkom had decided to celebrate the 24th anniversary of the revolution with a special meeting at the Studover factory. This was situated in the hamlet of Veketovka, to the south of the city. On the early morning of 6th of November, the obkom officials met in their underground command post in a small oak wood on the left bank of the Volga. After an excellent hot breakfast, the first secretary, the secretaries of the different sections, and the members of the bureau set out by car along the main road leading to the Volga. It was the same road that had been used during the night by tank and artillery units on their way to the Tumansk crossing. Ploughed up by the war, dotted with frozen mounds of brown dirt and puddles that seemed like sheets of tin, the steppe looked painfully sad. As you approached the Volga, you could hear the grating of drift ice. A strong wind was blowing from downstream. Crossing the Volga on an open iron barge would be no joyride. The soldiers waiting to cross had already taken their places in the barge. Their coats, whipped by the wind, they huddled together and tried to avoid touching the icy metal. They drew in their legs under the bench and beat out a mournful tap dance with their heels. When the wind got up, they just sat there and froze. They no longer had the strength to wipe their noses, to blow on their fingers, to clap their sides. Wisps of smoke from the tug's funnel spread out across the river. Against the ice, the smoke seemed very black indeed. The ice itself, under the low curtain of smoke, seemed very white. As it drifted across from Stalingrad, the ice seemed to be bringing the war with it. A crow with a large head was sitting thoughtfully on a block of ice. On the neighbouring block lay the tail of a burnt greatcoat. On a third block stood a stone-hard felt boot and a carbine whose twisted barrel had frozen into the ice. The cars from the obkom drove onto the barge. The secretaries and the members of the bureau got out and stood by the railings, listening to the ice as it moved slowly by. The old soldier in charge of the barge came over to the obkom transport secretary. Laktionov. His lips were quite blue, and he was wearing a black sheepskin coat and an army cap. In a hoarse voice, brought about by the damp of the river on top of many years of vodka and tobacco, he announced, "The first trip we made this morning, Comrade Secretary. There was this soldier lying there on the ice. The boys needed pickaxes to get him out. Some of them almost got drowned themselves. Look, there he is, on the bank, under that tarpaulin." The old man indicated the bank with a dirty mitten. Unable to see the corpse, and feeling somewhat ill at ease, Laktionov pointed at the sky and asked abruptly, "So what's he up to these days? Does he have any favourite time?" The old man gave a dismissive wave of the hand. He's not up to real bombing anymore." He began to curse the now feeble Germans, his voice suddenly becoming clear and ringing. Meanwhile, the tug drew slowly closer to the Stalingrad bank. Covered with small booths, huts, and supply dumps, it seemed quite ordinary and peaceful. The obkom officials, soon tired of standing in the wind, they got back into their cars, lit cigarettes, scratched themselves, and started chatting. The soldiers gazed at them through the glass, as though they were fish in an aquarium. The special meeting took place that evening. The invitations were no different from those sent in peacetime, except for the poor quality of the soft grey paper and the fact that there was no mention of the venue. The Stalingrad party leaders, the guests from the 64th Army, the workers and engineers from nearby factories were all accompanied by guides who had a good knowledge of the way. "Left here, and again here. Careful now, there's a bomb crater. And now some rails. And very careful here, there's a lime pit." The darkness was full of voices and the tramping of boots. Krimov arrived with the representatives of the 64th Army. He had visited their political section immediately after crossing the river. Something about the way all these people were walking through the labyrinth of the factory, in small groups and under cover of night, made Krimov think of clandestine celebrations before 1917. He was almost breathless with excitement. He was an experienced orator, and he knew he could give an impromptu speech there and then. He could share with everyone his excitement and joy at the similarity between the defense of Stalingrad and the revolutionary struggle of the Russian workers. Yes, this war, and the patriotic spirit it aroused, was indeed a war for the revolution. It had been no betrayal of the revolution to speak of Suvorov in the House 6-1. Stalingrad, Sebastopol, the fate of Radishchev, the power of Marx's manifesto, Lenin's appeals from the armoured car near the Finland station, all these were part of one and the same thing. He caught sight of Pryakin, the first secretary of the obkom and an old friend of his. He seemed as calm and unhurried as ever, but somehow Krimov was unable to find an opportunity to talk to him. There were a lot of things he wanted to talk about. He had gone to see him as soon as he had arrived at the command post of the obkom, but the telephone had kept ringing and people had kept dropping in. Pryakin had spoken to him only once, asking suddenly, "Did you ever know someone by the name of Getmanov?" "Yes, in Ukraine. He was a member of the Bureau of the Central Committee. Why do you ask?" Pryakin hadn't answered. Then there had been all the bustle of departure. Krimov had been offended that Pryakin hadn't offered him a lift in his own car. Twice they'd almost bumped into each other, but Pryakin had looked straight through him. The soldiers were now going down a lighted corridor. Shumilov, the army commander, a flabby man with a large chest and a large stomach, General Abramov, a Siberian with brown bulging eyes, the member of the military Soviet. In this group of men, in the good-hearted comradiness between them, in the steam rising from their tunics, padded jackets and coats, Krimov again sensed the spirit of the first years of the revolution, the spirit of Lenin. He had felt it as soon as he returned to the right bank. The members of the Presidium took their places. Piksin, the chairman of the Stalingrad Soviet, leant forward and directed a slow, chairman-like cough towards the noisiest part of the hall. He then announced the opening of this special meeting of the Stalingrad Soviet and party organizations, attended also by representatives of the military units and workers from the local factories, in celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. You could tell from the sound of the applause that the hands belonging to the men who were clapping were those of soldiers and workers. As Pryakin spoke, as slow and ponderous as ever, any connection between the present moment and what had happened in the past vanished at once. It was as though Pryakin had entered into a polemic with Krimov, as though he had deliberately adopted these measured tones in order to dash Krimov's excitement. The factories in the oblast were fulfilling the state plan. The agricultural districts on the left bank had satisfactorily, though with slight delays, provided their quota of grain for the state. The factories within the city and to the north of it were situated within the zone of military operations. Their failure to carry out their obligations to the state could therefore be understood. And this was the same man who had once stood beside Krimov during a revolutionary meeting at the front, who had torn off his cap and shouted, "Comrades, soldiers, brothers, to hell with this war and its blood! Long live freedom!" Now he gazed calmly around the hall and explained that the sudden drop in the quantity of grain supplied to the state was caused by the fact that the Zimonivchesky and Kotelnichesky districts had been unable to furnish supplies because they were part of the arena of military operations, while the Kalach and Kurmoyarsk regions were partially or completely occupied by the enemy. He went on to say that the population of the oblast, while continuing to work hard to fulfill their obligations to the state, had at the same time played an important part in military operations against the fascist invaders. He quoted figures. First, the number of workers from the city enrolled in militia units. And second, with the proviso that his data was incomplete, the number who had been decorated for their exemplary courage and valour while carrying out the tasks entrusted to them. As Krimov listened to the calm voice of the first secretary, he thought of the glaring disparity between his words and his real thoughts and feelings. It was far from senseless. It was the very coldness of his speech that confirmed just how absolute was the state's triumph. The faces of the workers and soldiers were grave and sullen. How strange and painful it was to remember people like Tarasov and Batyuk, to recall his conversations with the soldiers in House 6-1. It was particularly unpleasant to think of Grekov and how he had met his death. But why would Grekov matter to him? Why was that remark of his so troubling? Grekov had fired a shot at him. And why should the words spoken by Pryakin, his old comrade, the first secretary of the Stalingrad Obkom, sound cold and alien? How complicated it all was. Pryakin was summing up. And so we are delighted to be able to report to the great Stalin that the workers of the oblast have carried out their obligations to the Soviet state. Krimov looked out for Pryakin as he made his way through the crowd towards the exit. No, that was not the sort of speech to deliver in the middle of this terrible battle. Suddenly, Krimov caught sight of him. He'd stepped down from the dais and was standing beside Shumilov. He was staring straight at Krimov. And when he saw Krimov looking at him, he turned away. What on earth does that mean? Wondered Krimov. After the meeting, Krimov got a lift to the central power station. That night, after a recent raid by German bombers, it looked particularly sinister. The explosions had blasted out huge craters and thrown up great ramparts of earth. Some of the windowless workshops had subsided. The 3-story administrative building was in ruins. The transformers were still smoking. Little fangs of flame were playing lazily about them. A young Georgian sentry took Krimov through the yard, still lit up by the fire. Krimov saw his guide's fingers shake as he lit a cigarette. Stone buildings weren't the only things to have been devastated by the massive bombs. Krimov had been hoping to see Spiridov ever since he had received instructions to go to Beketovka. Perhaps Zhenya would be there. Perhaps Spiridonov would know something about her. Perhaps he had had a letter from her, and at the end she had written, "Have you heard anything about Nikolai Grigorovich?" He felt excited and happy. Perhaps Spiridonov would say, but Yevgenia Nikolaevna seemed very sad. Or perhaps, she was crying, you know. He'd been getting more and more impatient all day. He had wanted to drop in on Spiridonov during the afternoon. Instead, he'd gone to the command post of the 64th Army, despite the fact that a political instructor had whispered to him, "There's no point in hurrying, you know. The member of the military Soviet's been drunk since morning." It had indeed been a mistake to visit the general. As he sat in the waiting room of the underground command post, he had overheard the general, on the other side of the thin plywood partition, dictating a letter of congratulation to his neighbour Chukov. "Vasily Ivanovich, soldier and friend," he began solemnly. And then he burst into tears and, sobbing, repeated the words several times, "Soldier and friend, soldier and friend." "What's that you've written down?" he asked the typist, his voice suddenly severe. "Vasily Ivanovich, soldier and friend." Her bored tone must have seemed inappropriate. By the way of correcting her, repeated, with still greater exultation, "Vasily Ivanovich, soldier and friend." And once again he was overwhelmed by emotion. And then, with the same severity as before, "What have you written?" "Vasily Ivanovich, soldier and friend," replied the typist. There had indeed been no point in hurrying. The dim flames served more to obscure the way than to illuminate it. They seemed to be coming from the depths of the earth, or perhaps the earth itself had caught fire. The low flames were certainly heavy and damp enough. They reached the director's command post. Bombs had fallen nearby and thrown up great mountains of earth. The path had not yet been properly trodden down and was barely distinguishable. "You got here just in time for the party," said the guard. Krimov knew he wouldn't be able to speak freely to Spiridonov in the presence of other people. He told the guard to tell the director that a commissar from front headquarters was here to see him. Left on his own, a wave of uncontrollable anguish swept over him. "What is all this?" he said to himself. "I thought I was cured. Can't even the war exorcise her? What can I do?" Drive her away, get out of it, or it'll be the end of you," he muttered. But he didn't have the strength to leave, any more than he had the strength to drive her away. Then Spiridonov appeared. "Yes, comrade, what can I do for you?" he asked impatiently. "Don't you recognize me, Stepan Fyodorovitch?" Who is it?" Spiridonov sounded nervous. He looked Krimov in the face and suddenly cried out, "Oh, Nikolai! Nikolai Grigorovitch!" His arms were trembling as he flung them round Krimov's neck. "My dearest Nikolai," he said with a loud sniff. Krimov felt himself beginning to cry. He was shaken by this strange meeting in the middle of the ruins, and he felt alone, utterly alone. Spiridonov's trust and joy brought home to him how close he was to Yevgenia Nikolaevna's family. And this brought home his pain. Why? Why had she left him? Why had she caused him so much suffering? How could she? "You know what the war's done," said Spiridonov. "It's destroyed my life. My Marusya's dead." He told Krimov about Vera, about how, only a few days before, she had finally crossed to the left bank. "The girl's a fool." "What about her husband?" asked Krimov. "He probably died long ago. He's a fighter pilot." Unable to restrain himself any longer, Krimov asked, "What about Yevgenia Nikolaevna? Is she still alive? Where is she?" "Oh, she's alive all right. She's either at Kubyshev or Kazan." He looked at Krimov and said, "She's still alive. That's what matters." Yes, of course," said Krimov. He himself no longer knew what really mattered. All he knew was that he was in pain. Everything to do with Yevgenia Nikolaevna brought him pain. It would hurt him to know that some tragedy had happened to her. It would hurt him to be told that she was well and happy. Spiridonov began to talk about Alexandra Vladimirovna, Ludmila, and Seriotsa. And Krimov just nodded and muttered, "Yes, yes, yes, yes." "Come on, Nikolai," said Spiridonov. "You must come and visit my home. It's all I have left." The cellar was crammed with pallets, cupboards, equipment, sacks of flour, and huge bottles. The flickering oil lamps lit up only a small part of it. There were people sitting everywhere, on the pallets, on boxes and benches, along the walls. The air was stifling and full of the buzz of conversation. Spiridonov started to pour alcohol into glasses, mugs, and the lids of pots. Everyone fell silent, watching him attentively. The look in their eyes was calm and serious and full of faith. As he looked round, Krimov said to himself, "It's a pity Grekov's not here. He deserves a drink." But Grekov had already drunk all he was ever going to drink. Glass in hand, Spiridonov got up. "Now he'll go and spoil everything," thought Krimov, "like Pryakin." But Spiridonov just sketched a figure of 8 in the air with his glass and said, "Well, lads, it's time for a drink. Cheers." There was a clinking of glasses and tin mugs. The drinkers cleared their throats and nodded their heads. There were all sorts of people here. Before the war, the state had somehow kept them apart. They'd never sat down at one table, clapped each other on the shoulder and said, "No, you just listen to what I'm saying." Here, though, beneath the remains of the burning power station, they had become brothers. And this simple brotherhood was so important that they would happily have given their lives for it. A grey-haired night watchman began to sing an old song. Before the revolution, when Stalingrad was still called Tsaritsyn, it had been a favourite of the young lads from the French factory. He sang in the thin, high voice of his youth. His voice was unfamiliar to him now, and he listened to himself with the amused astonishment of a man listening to a stranger who's had too much to drink. Another old man, with black hair, frowned as he listened to this song about love and the pain of love. There was something wonderful about this singing, about this terrible moment that had brought together the director, the orderly from the bakery, the night watchman, and the sentry, that had brought together the Kalmyk, the Georgian, and the Russians. When the song was over, the old man with black hair frowned, still more fiercely, and himself began to sing, very slowly and out of tune. Away with the old world, let's shake its dust from our feet. Spiridonov and Nikolaev, the delegate from the Central Committee, both laughed and shook their heads. Krimov grinned at Spiridonov. So the old man was once a Menshevik? Spiridonov knew all there was to know about Andreev. He would gladly have told Krimov, but he was afraid Nikolaev would overhear. For a moment, the feeling of simplicity and brotherhood disappeared. Pavel Andreevich, that's the wrong song, he interrupted gently. Andreev fell silent, looking at him, and said, I'd never have thought it. I must have been dreaming. The Georgian sentry was showing Krimov where he had rubbed the skin off his hand. That's from digging out my friend, Serotsa Vorobyov. His black eyes glittered. Then rather breathlessly he said, I loved that Seryosa more than my own brother. The words were almost a scream. Meanwhile, the grey-haired night watchman, covered in sweat and a little worse for drink, had fastened on to Nikolaev. No, you listen to me now. Makalutsi says he loved Seryotis Vorobyov more than his own brother. I once worked in an anthracite mine. You should have seen the boss we had there. He really did love me. We drank together and I used to sing. He said, straight out, you're just like a brother to me, even if you're only a miner. We used to talk. We used to eat our lunch together. A Georgian, was he? Asked Nikolaev. Oh, what do you mean? He was Mr. Voskresensky, the owner of all the mines. But you'll never understand how much he respected me. A man who had a capital of millions. Is that clear? Nikolaev and Krimov exchanged glances. They both winked and shook their heads. Well, well, said Nikolaev. Now that really is something. You live and learn. That's right, said the old man, apparently unaware that he was being made fun of. It was a strange evening. Late at night, as people were beginning to leave, Spiridonov said to Krimov, Don't start looking for your coat, Nikolai. You're staying here for the night. He started preparing a place for Krimov to sleep. He did this very slowly, thinking carefully what to put where, the blanket, the padded jacket, the ground sheet. Krimov went outside. He stood for a while in the darkness, looking at the dancing flames, then went back down again. Spiridonov was still at it. Krimov finally took off his boots and lay down. Well, are you comfortable? Spiridonov asked. He patted Krimov on the head and smiled a kindly, drunken smile. To Krimov, the fire in the power station was somehow reminiscent of the bonfires in Okhotny Road on that night in January 1924 when they'd buried Lenin. Everyone else who had stayed behind seemed to be already asleep. It was pitch dark. Krimov lay there with his eyes open, thinking and remembering. There had been a harsh frost for some days. The dark winter sky over the cupolas of Strasny Monastery. Hundreds of men in greatcoats, leather jackets, caps with ear flaps, pointed helmets. At one moment, Strasnaya Square had suddenly turned white, and there were leaflets, government proclamations lying all over it. Lenin's body had been taken from Gorky to the railway station on a peasant's sledge. The runners had squeaked, the horses snorted. The coffin had been followed by his widow, Krupskaya, wearing a round fur cap held on by a grey headscarf, by his two sisters, Anna and Maria, by his friends, and by some of the village peasants. It might have been the funeral of some agronomist, a respected village doctor or teacher. Silence had fallen over Gorky. The polished tiles of the Dutch stoves had gleamed. Beside the bed with its white summer bedspread stood a small cupboard full of little bottles with white labels. There was a smell of medicine. A middle-aged woman in a white coat had come into the room. Out of habit, she walked on tiptoe. She'd gone past the bed and picked up a ball of twine with a piece of newspaper tied to the end. A kitten, asleep in the empty armchair, had looked up as it heard the familiar rustle of its toy. It had looked at the empty bed, yawned, and then settled down again. As they followed the coffin, Lenin's relatives and close comrades had begun reminiscing. His sisters remembered a little boy with fair hair and a difficult character. He had teased them a lot and been impossibly demanding. Still, he had been a good boy, and he had loved his mother and his brothers and sisters. His widow remembered him in Zurich, squatting on the floor and talking to the little granddaughter of Tilly, the landlady. Tilly had said, in the Swiss accent that Volodya found so amusing, "You should have children yourselves." He'd stolen a quick, sly look at Nazdeya Konstantinovna. Workers from the dynamo factory had come to Gorky. Volodya had forgotten his condition and got up to meet them. He'd wanted to say something, but had only managed to give a pitiful moan and a despairing wave of the hand. The workers had stood around in a circle watching him cry. They'd started to cry themselves. And then that frightened, pitiful look of his at the end, like a little boy turning to his mother. Then the station buildings had come into view. The locomotive with its tall funnel had seemed even blacker against the snow. Lenin's comrades, Rykov, Kamenev and Bukharin, had walked just behind the sledge, their beards white with hoarfrost. From time to time they'd glanced absent-mindedly at a swarthy, pockmarked man wearing a long greatcoat and boots with soft tops. They'd always felt a contemptuous scorn for his Caucasian style of dress. And had he been a little more tactful, he wouldn't have come to Gorky at all. This was a gathering for Lenin's very closest friends and relatives. None of them understood that this man was the true heir of Lenin, that he would supplant every one of them, even Krupskaya herself. No, it wasn't Bukharin, Rykov, and Zinoviev who were the heirs to Lenin, nor Trotsky. They were all mistaken. None of them had been chosen to continue Lenin's work. But even Lenin himself had failed to understand this. Nearly 2 decades had passed since that day, since the body of Lenin, the man who had determined the fate of Russia, of Europe, of Asia, of humanity itself, had been drawn through the snow on a creaking sledge. Krimov couldn't stop thinking about those days. He remembered the bonfires blazing in the night, the frost-covered walls of the Kremlin, the hundreds of thousands of weeping people, the heart-rending howl of factory hooters, Yevdokimov's stentorian voice as he stood on a platform and read an appeal to the workers of the world. The small group who had carried the coffin into the hastily built wooden mausoleum. Krimov had climbed the carpeted steps of the House of the Unions and walked past the mirrors draped in black and red ribbons. The warm air had been scented with pine needles and full of mournful music. He had gone into the hall and seen the bowed heads of the men he was used to seeing on the tribune at the Smolny or at Staraya Ploshchad. In 1937, he had seen the same bowed heads in the same building. As they listened to the sonorous, inhuman tones of Prosecutor Vyshinsky, the accused had probably remembered how they'd walked behind the sledge and stood beside Lenin's coffin, listening to that mournful music. Why, on this anniversary of the revolution, had he suddenly remembered that distant January? Dozens of men who'd helped Lenin to create the Bolshevik Party had proved to be foreign spies and provocateurs. And someone who'd never occupied a central position in the party, who'd never been highly thought of as a theoretician, had proved to be the saviour of the party's cause, the bearer of its truth. Why had they all confessed? Questions like these were best forgotten. But tonight Krimov was unable to forget them. Why did they all confess? And why do I keep silent? Why have I never found the strength to say, I really don't believe that Bukharin was a saboteur, provocateur, and assassin? I even raised my hand to vote. I signed, I gave a speech, and wrote an article, and I still believe that my zeal was genuine. But where were my doubts then? Where was all my confusion? What is it that I'm trying to say? That I'm a man with two consciences? Or that I'm two men, each with his own conscience? But then that's how it's always been, for all kinds of people, not just me. Grekov had merely given voice to what many people felt without admitting it. He had put into words the thoughts that most worried Krimov, that sometimes most attracted him. But Krimov had at once been overwhelmed with hatred and anger. He had wanted to make Grekov lick his boots. He had wanted to break him. If it had come to it, he would have shot him without hesitation. Pryakin's words were spoken in the cold language of officialdom. He had talked, in the name of the state, about grain procurements, workers' obligations, and percentages of the plan. Krimov had always disliked the soulless speeches delivered by soulless bureaucrats, but these soulless bureaucrats were his oldest comrades, the men he had marched in step with. The work of Lenin was the work of Stalin. It had become embodied in these men, in this state, and Krimov wouldn't hesitate to give his life for the glory of this work. What about Mostovskoy? He too was an old Bolshevik. But not once had he spoken out, even in defence of people whose revolutionary honour he had never questioned. He too had kept silent. Why? And Koloskov, that kind, upright young fellow who had attended Krimov's courses in journalism, coming from a village in the country, he had a lot to say about collectivization. He told Krimov about the scoundrels who included someone's name on a list of kulaks simply because they had their eye on his house or garden, or because they were personal enemies. He had told Krimov about the terrible hunger, about the ruthlessness with which the peasants' last grain of corn had been confiscated. He had begun to cry as he talked about one wonderful old man who had given his life to save his wife and granddaughter. Not long afterwards, Krimov had read an article by Koloskov on the wall newspaper. Apparently the kulaks felt a violent hatred for everything new and were burying their grain in the ground. Why, after crying his heart out, has Koloskov written such things? Why had Mostovskoy never said anything? Out of cowardice? Krimov had said things that went against his deepest feelings, but he had always believed what he said in his speeches and articles. He was still convinced that his words were a true reflection of his beliefs, although there had been times when he had said, "What else can I do? It's for the sake of the revolution." Yes, Krimov had indeed failed to defend friends whose innocence he had felt sure of. Sometimes he'd said nothing. Sometimes he'd mumbled incoherently. Sometimes he'd done still worse. There were occasions when he had been summoned by the party committee, the district committee, the city committee, and the oblast committee, by the security organs themselves. They had asked his opinion about people he knew, people who were members of the party. He had never said anything bad about his friends. He'd never slandered them. He'd never written denunciations. What about Grekov? Grekov was an enemy. Where enemies were concerned, Krimov had never felt a trace of pity. He'd never worn kid gloves in dealing with them. But why had he had nothing more to do with the families of comrades who had been arrested? He'd stopped phoning or visiting them. Of course, if he'd met them by chance, he'd always said hello. He'd never crossed over the other side of the street. But then there were some people, usually old women, lower middle-class housewives, who would help you send parcels to someone in camp. You could arrange for someone in camp to write to you at their address, and for some reason they were quite unafraid. These same old women, these superstitious domestics and illiterate nannies, would even take in children whose mothers and fathers had been arrested, saving them from orphanages and reception centres. Members of the party, on the other hand, avoided these children like the plague. Were these old women braver and more honourable than old Bolsheviks like Mostovskoy and Krimov? People are able to overcome fear. Children pluck up their courage and enter a dark room. Soldiers go into battle. Young men can leap into an abyss with only a parachute to save him. But what about this other fear, this fear that millions of people find insuperable, this fear written up in crimson letters over a leaden sky of Moscow, this terrible fear of the state? No, fear alone cannot achieve all this. It was the revolutionary cause itself that freed people from morality in the name of morality, that justified today's Pharisees, hypocrites, and writers of denunciations in the name of the future, that explained why it was right to elbow the innocent into the ditch in the name of the happiness of the people. This was what enabled you to turn away from children whose parents had been sent to camps. This was why it was right for a woman, because she had failed to denounce an innocent husband, to be torn away from her children and sent for 10 years to a concentration camp. The magic of the revolution had joined with people's fear of death, their horror of torture, their anguish when the first breath of the camps blew on their faces. Once, if you took up the cause of the revolution, you could expect prison, forced labour, years of homelessness, the scaffold. But now, and this was the most terrible thing of all, the revolution paid those who were still faithful to its great ideal with supplementary rations, with dinners in the Kremlin canteen, with special food parcels, with private cars, trips to holiday resorts, tickets for first-class coaches. "Are you still awake, Nikolai Grigorovich?" asked Spiridonov out of the darkness. "Just," said Krimov. "I'm just falling asleep." "Oh, I'm sorry, I won't disturb you again." It was over a week since the night when Mostovskoy had been summoned by Obersturmbannführer Liss. His feeling of tension, of feverish expectancy, had been replaced by a heavy depression. There were moments when he began to think he had been completely forgotten by both his friends and his enemies, that they looked on him as a weak, half-senile old man, a goner. One clear, still morning, he was taken to the bathhouse. This time the SS guard sat down on the steps outside, putting his Tommy gun down beside him, and lit a cigarette. The sky was clear, the sun was warm. The soldier obviously preferred not to enter the damp building. The prisoner on duty inside came up to Mostovskoy. "Good morning, dear comrade Mostovskoy." Mostovskoy let out a cry of astonishment. In front of him stood Brigade Commissar Osipov. He was wearing a uniform with a band on the sleeve and waving an old rag in his hand. They embraced. "I managed to get myself a job in the bathhouse," Osipov explained hurriedly. "I'm standing in for the usual cleaner. I wanted to see you. Kotikov, the general, and Zlata Krylets all send their greetings. But first, how are they treating you? How are you feeling? What do they want from you? You can talk while you're undressing." Mostovskoy told him about his interrogation. Osipov stared at him with his dark, prominent eyes. "Oh, the blockheads think they'll be able to win you over." "But why? Why? What's the point of it all?" "They may be interested in information of a historical nature, in the personalities, the founders, the leaders of the party, or they may be intending to ask you to write letters, statements, and appeals. They're wasting their time. They may torture you, comrade Mostovskoy." "The fools are wasting their time," repeated Mostovskoy. "But tell me, how are things with you?" "Oh, better than could have been expected," said Osipov in a whisper. "The main thing is that we've made contact with the factory workers. We're stockpiling weapons, machine guns and hand grenades. People bring in the components one by one, and we assemble in the huts at night. For the time being, of course, the quantities are insignificant. That's Yershov's doing, said Mostovskoy. Good for him. Then he shook his head sadly as he took off his shirt and looked at his bare chest. Once again he felt angry with himself for being so old and weak. I have to inform you as a senior comrade that Yershov is no longer with us. What do you mean? How come? He's been transferred to Buchenwald. Oh, why on earth? He was a splendid fellow. Well, in that case, he'll still be a splendid fellow in Buchenwald. But how did that happen? And why? A split appeared in the leadership. Yershov enjoyed a widespread popularity and quite turned his head. Nothing would make him submit to the centre. He's a doubtful individual, an alien element. The position became more confused with every step we took. The first rule in any underground work is iron discipline, and there we were with two different centres, one of them outside the party. We discussed the position and came to a decision. A Czech comrade who worked in the office slipped Yershov's card into the pile for Buchenwald. He was put on the list automatically. What could be simpler, said Mostovskoy. It was a unanimous decision of all the communists, said Osipov. He stood in front of Mostovskoy in his miserable clothes, holding a rag in one hand, stern, unshakable, certain of his rectitude, of his terrible, more than divine right to make the cause he served into the supreme arbiter of a man's fate. And the naked, skinny old man, one of the founders of a great party, sat there in silence, his shoulders hunched and his head bowed. It was night and he was back in Liss's office. He was overwhelmed by terror. What if Liss hadn't been lying? What if he had had no ulterior motive? If he'd simply wanted to talk to another human being? He drew himself up to his full height. Then, just as 10 years before, during the period of collectivization, just as during the political trials, when the comrades of his youth had been condemned to the scaffold, he said, I submit to this decision. I accept it as a member of the party. He took his jacket from the bench and removed several scraps of paper from the lining. They were texts he had drawn up for leaflets. Suddenly, in his mind's eye, he saw Ikonikov's face and large, cow-like eyes. If only he could listen once again to the preacher of senseless kindness. I wanted to ask about Ikonikov, he said. Did the Czech slip his card in too? Ah, the holy fool! The man you used to call the blancmange, he was executed. He refused to work on the construction of an extermination camp. Casey was ordered to shoot him. That night, Mostovskoy's leaflets about Stalingrad were stuck up on the walls of the barrack huts.